So let's take a step forward from the macro events here and focus on the characters that comprise our party. Much like Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy XII deals subtly with the idea of class, and our main party originate in different places within the political spectrum and the social strata of Ivalice. And incidentally, most characters in our party have, for whatever reason, been ejected from their established place within the social hierarchy, such as Bash being a disgraced knight, Fran leaving the wood, Vaan being orphaned, and etc. Basically, each are outcast into this motley group that muddles through the game events together. So, first of the characters that I'd like to discuss is the somewhat controversial character of Vaan, because being an Aladdin-esque street urchin, he's the lowest denomination on the social spectrum and represents the poverty-stricken, oppressed people of the Damascan peasantry. As such, he's a window into the culture and the fallout of the turbulent authoritarian society, through which the player develops an immediate idea of how war, and by extension the Arcadian occupation, has negatively impacted the people of Dalmasca, and specifically Rabanastra. His role as a peasant also permits him to be something of a window for the player into the larger political events of the game, because, much like Tidus from Final Fantasy X, he's an outsider, and so his education in the events taking place are simultaneously the player's education into the events taking place, which is quite a useful narrative device, I think, particularly when we get into the higher level politics, concerning Ash and the Okuria and Vayne. Now, the controversial aspect of Vaan is that, despite Final Fantasy XII being intended as an ensemble story, he seems to be posited as more of a central character, particularly by way of us controlling him so often. Unlike Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy IX, which from the very outset shifts the player control through various characters and situations, such as controlling Vivi, Zidane and Steiner, all within the opening 15 minutes of Final Fantasy IX, 12 sees a very quick onboarding sequence where we play as Rex, before shifting to control Vaan for the majority of the game time. So the focus on Vaan is controversial with some fans because many feel that his relevance to the core story and political machinations and vendettas between Ash and Vayne and Bash and Gabranth is quite minimal. And while he does of course have an axe to grind in avenging the death of his brother, this scenario is somewhat detached from the macro events that unfold, and arguably they only propel him so far into the story for someone who's the most controlled character in the story. By comparison, we have, going back to Tidus from Final Fantasy X, he's a similar window into events sort of character, but his role in the story actually shifts the entire course of Final Fantasy X's trajectory. He changes Yuna's pilgrimage to one of destroying sin rather than placating it. He also has a defining love story in the game and a resolution with his absent father, Jecht, in the end game. So his role as the player character and the hero is clearly defined and closely associated with events, whereas Vaan's arguably is not. And indeed, it's Bash who has the resolution with an absent brother in the conclusion of Final Fantasy XII. This controversy has also been amplified by the fact Square developers have come out and quite bluntly stated that Bash was intended to be the hero character, but he was later replaced because he was considered too old for the game's target demographic to relate to. And the fact that Vaan was written purely as a response to a marketing team trying to appeal to a specific audience to gain sales, rather than being an integral, organic aspect of the story, have led many to dismiss him as a superficial addition and a gimmicky sort of character. Now, for my part, on the one hand, I can understand these sentiments, and creating a character with the intention to sell something, rather than as a part of a cohesive artistic narrative, does bother me on some level, and there are moments where Vaan's presence in events does stick out somewhat. But really, taking a step back and considering him simply as a character in an ensemble, rather than one that's been given the spotlight, I think he does work quite well as a personality and a contribution to the party. As previously mentioned, him and Pinello represent an important aspect of the social climate by being orphans forced towards thievery. He also brings that boundless optimism and humorous naivety to bear, which can only come from an aspirational teenager sort of character, and it contrasts very well with Bash's severity and Ash's royal propriety, I think. There's some humorous transactions between Vaan and his female companions too, where he asks some quite unseemly questions, oblivious to the fact that he's speaking to a lady, or indeed royalty. A particularly good one is where he asks Fran her age and gets a very frosty response, which indicates his complete lack of social awareness. The fact that Vaan also aspires to be a sky pirate complements his exchanges with Balthier too, as the latter, in many ways, embodies precisely what Vaan wishes to become. And there's some nice moments, such as Vaan laying eyes upon the airship for the first time, that injects some light-hearted personality into the game that otherwise is fraught with quite severe political turmoil. Now, I noted Rex earlier, and part of Vaan's story is the fact we witness his brother's murder at the hands of Gabranth at the beginning of the game. And much like Cypher being inspired to become a knight due to Laguna's movie in Final Fantasy VIII, this is a small, separated event that loosely draws Vaan into the central plotline with some central antagonists. Personally, the plot didn't necessarily warrant this angle for his character, as his contempt for Arcadia could have been initiated by his social circumstance, or indeed, he could have simply stayed as an opportunistic thief that fell in with Balthier. Perhaps he didn't warrant this tragic backstory. But much like Zidane from Final Fantasy IX and Locke from Final Fantasy VI, Square have often felt compelled to give the happy-go-lucky character a tragic past to try and authenticate and set up their future conflicts. That wraps up my thoughts on Vaan. I think he's a great character and an asset to the game, with some humorous dialogue and teenage naivety to liven up the severity of the more dramatic party members. I believe he was simply a secondary character who was misrepresented and poorly positioned by the developers as a central protagonist in what should either have been a completely and overtly ensemble story, or possibly Ash's or Bash's story, which has subsequently tarnished some people's opinions of the game and this character to this day.